Hello and welcome to Pricking It, Bellway's very own podcast which gives you a unique insight into careers in the property building industry and life at Bellway. We'll be getting to know the Bellway team, debunking some stereotypes about working in the industry and giving you an insight into a career in construction and housing. I'm Laura Bell, Head of Organisation Development at Bellway. In this episode I'm joined by Simon Park. Simon is a Chartered Environmentalist and the Head of Sustainability at Bellway's Group Office. With over a decade of experience in sustainability roles, Simon joined Bellway in 2023 after working across various sectors, including social housing, construction and higher education. At Bellway, he coordinates the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy, which encompasses all aspects of sustainability from carbon management to waste reduction. So without further ado, let's start bricking it. So, Simon, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you feeling?
Nervous.
I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. So, can you just start by introducing yourself, please, and telling us a little bit more about the role of Head of Sustainability at Bellway?
Thanks, Laura. So, my name's Simon Park, Group Head of Sustainability at Bellway. My core role is to coordinate the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy, and the vision behind that is to put people and planet first. And the way that we'll do that is by delivering on 8 different business priorities, which are organised, imagine on a spectrum from people on one side, so customers and communities, employer of choice, building quality homes safely, to planet on the other side, which is more traditional environmental sustainability, so biodiversity, resource efficiency, carbon reduction, etc. And then kind of straddling between those two, you've got charitable engagement, which is, I suppose, more traditional corporate social responsibility. And then you've got sustainable supply chain, because our supply chain is really important in terms of us meeting our long-term goals. So my role on a day-to-day basis is really to make sure that we are driving progress in 8 of those business priority areas.
It sounds like you've done lots of things in your career so far. How on earth did you get to be the Head of Sustainability at Bellway? What did your career journey look like?
To be honest, Laura, I feel very fortunate to be sat here talking with you in this role. And actually, if I'm going to be totally honest with you, there's probably quite a lot of luck involved in doing what I'm doing now. So if I rewind back to 2010, I'd just come back from travelling in Australia and I was working in a call centre for a well-known bank. And then someone told me about a really interesting opportunity to sell gas and electricity to small to medium enterprises, which I thought sounded great. So I ended up moving from the bank to this other company, and that really was my introduction to energy. So I did that for a year, and then I thought, actually, this is something that I'm really interested in. So I went back to university and I studied a master's degree in renewable energy and business, which was for people from a non-scientific background, but it also had a business element to it, which is really useful for what I do now. Then following from that, I ended up working for a social housing company in Sunderland, which had a housing element to it. And part of my role was to coordinate their sustainability strategy. So actually similar to what I do now, but I was looking at housing, construction, and then also randomly they had their own glass and solar panel factory in County Durham. So I was looking at efficiency of processes and that sort of thing. Then I moved over to a construction contractor based out of County Durham, and they really pushed me to do health and safety qualification as well. So I did that qualification, and then I would go out on projects across the northeast in Scotland and do health, safety, environment inspections to understand if projects were being delivered in accordance with environmental management systems and health and safety systems and that sort of thing. Then my career took a bit of a sideways move, that I moved into higher education, and I worked in higher education for 4.5 years. And then middle of 2023, I had someone contact me about an amazing role at Bellway, and I suppose the rest is kind of history.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing, Simon. So what does a typical day look like for you as Head of Sustainability?
As I mentioned, the key part of my role is to coordinate the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy. And in order to bring that to life, we've got quite a strict governance structure. So what that means is that on a quarterly basis, I need to meet up with the business sponsors for each of those business priority areas. So we've got an action plan with like over 120 actions, and each of those has got a core business sponsor and a secondary sponsor. And I meet up with those guys on a quarterly basis just to ask them how they're getting on with their objectives and targets. So, for example, for sustainable supply chain, we've got an objective for 85% of our top 100 suppliers to be Supply Chain Sustainability School Gold members. So I'll meet up with our head of procurement regularly to ask him, Adrian, how are you getting on with this target? How are you getting those stragglers to be gold members? And that's just one example. And then following those meetings, I'll meet up with our Better with Bellway leadership team, which includes senior leaders within the business, and then I'll brief them on the results of those leadership meetings. And then following that meeting, I have to prepare a report for the board so that they can understand how we're getting on with our key targets. So Better with Bellway really does take up a large proportion of my role.
And I know from like other conversations we've had, a lot of your role is coordinating stakeholders and then going out and talking to people both internally and externally about Better with Bellway and what it means, and making sure that people understand why it's so important. So I think it's fair to say it's quite a busy role. I can imagine it's a very varied role as well. Have you got much of a team working with you?
So within our group technical and commercial team, there's myself, and then there's our senior technical and innovation coordinator, our head of technical and innovation, and then we've got our sustainability data reporting manager. But as I alluded to before, the Better with Bellway strategy, it's really integrated within the business. So rather than having a massive sustainability team of like 15 or 20 people, actually what we have is that sustainability is integrated within people's day-to-day roles, so they have a proportion of their time is dedicated to Better with Bellway and sustainability.
Interesting. Now that's all great, but on the Brick in It podcast, we like to really get to know our guests. So Simon, tell me, what is your favourite go-to afternoon snack?
Well, I've been thinking about this one, and actually I'm going to go with a banana. And the reason for that is because, one, I like bananas, but also I did run the Great North Run in September gone dressed as a banana to help raise money for Cancer Research UK and move towards our charitable engagement target.
Excellent. Love the shameless plug. So I really wanted to get you on the podcast today because sustainability is something that I'm quite interested in, but I know a lot of our listeners would be interested in that as a topic. So firstly, can you just take us through what are the main reasons for an organisation like Bellway to become more sustainable?
I think that's a good question, and I think actually a lot of the time people jump into the detail when it comes to sustainability, and they do that without actually thinking what are the arguments for it. So for me, it really boils down to three core pillars of an argument. So you've got a moral, a legal, and a financial case. I think in terms of morality, there's this concept of future generations. So people who are inhabiting Earth ahead of us, like what inheritance are we going to be giving them? If we blow through the carbon budget and we use all of the natural resources, then they aren't going to be able to fulfill their ambitions. So I think as an organisation which has a significant environmental impact, because if we're building 10,000 homes a year, you can imagine the resources that go into that, then we have a moral obligation to do that in the most sustainable way possible in order to give a good inheritance to future generations. Then legally, there's a lot of laws around sustainability. So if I just think of two examples, so we've got biodiversity net gain, which came into force on the 12th of February this year, and that is a planning requirement for any organisation building a development needs to achieve 10% biodiversity net gain, otherwise you won't get planning permission. Also, what's coming down the line is the Future Home Standard, so that will require all developers to not install gas boilers anymore, so got to go down the air source heat pump route or district heating. So they're two laws that we need to think about. And then financially, so there's two arguments here. So first of all, I always like to talk about the sweet spot for sustainability. So if something saves us money or improves our brand and it's sustainable, then that's 100% what we should be doing. So, for example, in the last year, we reduced the amount of waste we produce per house by 20%. The result of that is a saving of around about £1.5 million. So it's reduced our environmental impact and it's saved us money. Also, because we are a FTSE 250 house builder, we've got a lot of interest from investors, and they want to see that they are investing in companies that are taking sustainability seriously. And if you have a look in our annual report, you'll see comprehensive disclosures around sustainability, and there's something called the alphabet soup of sustainability disclosures. So SASB, TCFD, TNFD, all of this sort of stuff. But really, what it all boils down to is that an organisation has identified and is addressing climate and nature-related risks and opportunities. So moral, legal, financial, they're the key arguments for sustainability.
So how has Bellway responded to these arguments for sustainability? I mean, obviously we've got the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy, but can you just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so in response to this challenge to be more sustainable, back in 2021, we engaged with a consultancy called Simply Sustainable, and they carried out something called a materiality assessment. And what that means is that they spoke to a lot of stakeholders, so like customers, employees, investors, etc., and asked them what topics are important to you in terms of sustainability. And then they boiled that down into the key issues. And the result of that materiality assessment was the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy, as I've outlined. So really, we've taken on board that challenge and we've developed the strategy, which we're now delivering, as I mentioned.
Okay, so drilling into that a little bit further, what are we as a business doing about carbon emissions?
I think that's a key question, and that when it comes to sustainability, that's what everyone wants to know, because if you think about our biggest impact as a business, actually it's our carbon footprint. So if you take all of the different scopes of emissions, which is a bit of jargon in terms of where emissions happen, actually we're responsible for between 1 million and 1.5 million tonnes of carbon every year. And in response to that, we've set ambitious science-based targets. So what that means is that we have targets which are aligned with climate science, and you might have heard of the 1.5 degree warming scenario of the Paris Agreement. So we set targets that by 2030, we want to reduce our direct emissions, which is, can you imagine, everything we are directly responsible for. So burning diesel in a generator on site, running our offices, our fleet of vehicles, that's our direct emissions. So we want to reduce that by 46% by 2030. Now, last year, actually, we recorded about a 44.5% reduction. So we're on the way, really, to meeting that target. Because what we've done is we've bought renewable electricity contracts, and also we are substituting diesel on site for green diesel, which is more sustainable. And then the biggest part of your footprint actually is your indirect emissions, which is also called Scope 3. So we're looking to reduce those by 55% per metre squared by 2030. And that's really divided into two key categories. So you've got what they call the use of the sold product. So for us, that's the houses that we build, and then we model it over a 60-year period to understand what the emissions involve in terms of heating and running a home. And then you've also got what we call purchased goods and services. So if you can imagine that there's a lot of energy that goes into mining raw materials, making those raw materials into a product, transporting them to site. So purchased goods and services and use of the sold product are the key areas in terms of Scope 3 emissions.
So it's all very interesting, this talk about emissions, and as always there's loads of acronyms because we just love an acronym, don't we? But I know we've got an interesting research project going on at the minute, haven't we, in partnership with the University of Salford. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the University of Salford Energy House 2.0, it's a really exciting project that ourselves and then Barrett Redrow are involved in. So if you can picture that at the University of Salford, they've got a massive warehouse that's temperature controlled. So the academics at the university can turn it down to -5 degrees or up to 40 degrees. And then what ourselves and Barrett have done are we've built 2 homes to what they thought at the time was going to be the future home standard. So as I mentioned earlier, future home standards mandating that there'll be no gas boilers installed in a home. And it's also looking at the improved fabric performance of the building, so windows, cavities, that sort of thing. So ourselves and Barrett have built these 2 homes, and then they've been tested because the academics want to understand, well, 2 things really. So first of all, how does the building fabric perform in accordance with the design? Because there's something called the performance gap, which is whereby you've got a design over here, but then once it's built, it performs nowhere near the design. So what they found actually is the homes that we built were within 10% of the intended design, which actually is industry leading. So that was one box ticked. And then the other thing is they wanted to assess the performance of the heating system. So as I mentioned, the future home standard means that we'll not be installing gas boilers anymore. Bellway, we're going to go down the air source heat pump route. So we installed an air source heat pump, underfloor heating on the ground floor and radiators on the first floor. And the academics at Salford, they tested how the house performed at different temperatures. And what they found is that on a typical winter's day, which is about 5 degrees, actually it would only cost about £1.85 a day to heat your home, which shows that actually you can transition to air source heat pumps and it should be cost effective for the customer. So that bit of industry leading research I think is really important so that we can prove to the rest of the industry and also the wider public that actually the transition to all electric and air source heat pumps will be successful.
It's really interesting stuff. And I think one of the themes that's weaved through a lot of the things you've mentioned is innovation. And that word comes up quite a lot. And I guess on that subject, I do happen to know that we've worked with the graduates a little bit on some interesting projects. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing around waste management and how the graduates were involved?
Yeah, so with our 2022 graduate intake, myself and our head of procurement, who I mentioned earlier, we set the graduates a challenge to build 3 homes and then understand how much waste is produced at each different stage of the build. Because as I mentioned before, we've reduced our waste by 20% in the last year. But in the long term, the target for the industry is to get to 0 avoidable waste, which, as you can imagine, is a huge challenge. So we set the grads a challenge to go and build these 3 homes, and then Adrian and I were caught up with them on a regular basis, and then the grads presented the results of the work that they'd done to myself, Adrian, and also a group of senior leaders, and they broke down the waste that was produced at each different stage of construction, and then they produced a detailed report. And what they did is they compared the results of what they'd found to the 0 avoidable waste roadmap, so that we could understand what we needed to do in order to meet that ambitious target.
And what happened, I guess, as a result of that project? Was there any recommendations or changes that we would take forward as a result?
Well, I think one thing that we're doing anyway, which will reduce waste, is the move to timber frame. So you may have seen that we announced our Bellway home space project. So what that is it's where the frame of a home is built in a factory and then transported to site. And because you've done that, then you've got less cementitious product, less brick and block on site. So therefore you've got less potential to waste. And if we look at our waste performance, actually it's our Scottish divisions who tend to do best, because for one reason or another in Scotland, building out a timber frame has been more popular over the years, whereas in England we're kind of lagging behind a bit. So I think that timber frame project is something that will be really interesting from a waste perspective and also from a carbon perspective too. So as I mentioned before, we've got scope 3 emissions in the purchased goods and services. Actually, timber during its growth period, it sequesters carbon, so it takes it out of the atmosphere, as I'm sure you're aware. And then during the time that the timber's in a house, it's actually stored it. So you've got it sequestering carbon, it's storing carbon, and then as well as that, you're substituting high carbon products like brick and blocks. So timber frame factory, I think, is definitely going to be really interesting from a waste perspective and a carbon perspective.
Fascinating. Lots of new developments, so it's all quite exciting in this space. So we've talked a bit about waste management, we've talked a bit about innovation, but another key sort of component in the sustainability space is our relationship with our suppliers. How do they fit into all of this, and what are we doing to engage with them and take them on the journey with us?
Yeah, I would agree. I think our supply chain are going to be key to not only us, but the whole industry meeting our obligations. So if we think about our subcontractors, so if you take a plumbing contractor, they've been used to installing gas boilers for years and years. Now they're going to have to move over to air source heat pumps. So one thing that we've done in our Manchester division at Barton Quarter, we have built something called the Innovation Hub, which is whereby we've created 4 homes to different stages of construction so that our contractors can come on and have a look to see what a good air source heat pump install looks like. And we're also pushing our contractors to do extra training and certification so that they're ready for the transition to heat pumps. Then if we think about our wider supply chain, so that's like our material suppliers, etc. As I mentioned earlier, we are pushing them to get Supply Chain Sustainability School Gold membership, which means that they need to complete a certain amount of training and then also submit a case study to the Supply Chain Sustainability School outlining how they've implemented sustainability within their organisation. Then we also organise what's called a supplier discovery meeting, which is a detailed call with myself, our head of procurement, and then our suppliers to understand what's their sustainability strategy and how does that align with what we need to do. And then in March next year, we're organising our first ever supplier conference, which is going to have a real emphasis on sustainability. So I think we're doing a lot with our subcontractors and material suppliers on this.
All sounds brilliant. How has it been in terms of implementing the Better with Bellway strategy and sort of aligning that with day-to-day life at Bellway?
So I think in terms of implementing the Better with Bellway strategy, for me, and this is a bit of a buzzword, but it's the governance structure that has really helped us take it from an action plan or just something in the annual report to actually really part of people's day-to-day jobs. So if you have a look at our annual report, actually, the whole title of it is Better with Bellway. And then a lot of the things that people are working on, actually, it's a key part of their role. So, for example, if I think about customers and communities, so a couple of our key KPIs there are the 8-week survey, which customers have, and the 9-month survey. So our customer care team, they're really looking at that all of the time anyway as part of their roles. And then we've now incorporated that within the Better with Bellway sustainability strategy. Similarly with procurement, so supplier relationships is something that the guys are looking at anyway. Now they've just added an extra dimension in terms of sustainability. So I think because we've got that strong governance structure, it's really helped us implement things. And it's not just like it's a standalone thing with a massive sustainability team working on it. Actually, it's really integrated within everyone's day-to-day jobs.
And I guess as well, from a really senior level, there's, all the way up to the board, there's real endorsement and sponsorship of that whole agenda. And, I know they're really interested in hearing updates, how the business is performing in terms of those objectives. So I guess Bellway sort of really put their money where their mouth is in terms of pushing forward that agenda.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think if you look at the makeup of the Better with Bellway leadership team, so you've got 2 main board members as part of that team that I meet up with on a quarterly basis, and they're spending their time to understand what's happening with the strategy. And actually, in some of the meetings, we'll go through that 120-line action plan, and they'll pick up on things and challenge things. As well as that, so on an annual basis, we come up with new objectives and targets just to make sure that the strategy is up to date. and they will vet those objectives and targets to say, well, actually, is it stretching enough? Is it hard enough? Is it where we want to go? And then following that meeting, the main board approve those targets. So if you have a look in the annual report, there'll always be a section about upcoming KPIs, and they've followed that process. So yeah, 100% they're bought in. And I think for it to be a success, they have to be, because if they weren't interested, then it would just fail.
So has it been easy to implement the Better with Bellway strategy into the everyday workings of Bellway? Because as we know, Bellway is quite a large, complex organisation, and I can imagine communicating that at all levels must have been quite challenging.
Yeah, I would agree. I think probably within Bellway Group, because we've got the Better with Bellway governance structure, and you've got key members of staff who are business sponsors for those business priorities, actually implementing the strategy has been reasonably straightforward. I think, as you allude to, though, when you've got 20 divisions and 200 plus construction projects on the go at any one time, then getting that message out actually is a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. It's not something that's ever going to be fully achieved, because as you can imagine, with subcontractors, you get different gangs coming out on site, so it's a constantly changing workforce. I think, though, with the new pathway system that's coming, I think that's been an excellent tool really for us to put all of the Better with Bellway information in one place and then update that. So what's going to be coming in the new year is a new pathway section about the Future Home Standard, which is very much linked to Better with Bellway. And our head of communications, Paul Lawler, has filmed a video at Barton Quarter at the Innovation Hub, as I mentioned before. So it's a challenge, but I think actually we've got a really good foundation there in terms of the governance structure. But we're going to just continue, I guess, chipping away at it.
And just for those who don't know, what is Pathway?
So Pathway is our staff intranet communication system, which every Bellway employee gets access to, and then you can go on and find out a whole range of things. So, for example, there's a HR section which has a benefits hub where they'll talk about, for example, the cycle to work scheme, or how you can get a discounted EV car through salary sacrifice, that sort of thing. So Pathway, actually, I think it's a very good staff communications tool.
Okay. And I need to ask you before we move on, just because I know as certain listeners will be interested to know, what on earth does cementitious mean?
So cementitious refers to cement. So if you imagine that after water, cement is the most widely used product in the world. And if you ranked carbon emissions, if you imagine you would have China, USA, cement. So that shows you how much of a challenge it is in terms of carbon emissions, because of the process in order to actually create it creates carbon as a chemical reaction, and then the amount of cement that's actually used across the world, because it's such a good product, because it works so well, means that the emissions are huge. But as I mentioned, we are transitioning to different types of products with the timber frame factory, etc. And as things move on, I think we'll probably use more natural kind of bio-based products and move away from cement, but it'll always be there.
Thank you. That kind of leads us nicely on to, what do you hope to see for the future of sustainability at Bellway?
I think that the big challenge for us is going to be achieving net zero carbon. And what that will look like is probably between a 95 and 100% reduction in carbon emissions sometime between 2040 and 2050, which is the UK government target. And what that will mean is probably a future version of the Future Home Standard, which will go further. And as well as that, as we've talked about earlier, there's going to be a lot on the supply chain. So steel, cement, etc. Those supply chain partners really need to reduce their emissions. But we're seeing that already with, for example, steel manufacturers closing down fossil fuel powered furnaces and creating new electric furnaces. So actually we are on the right trajectory in order to get there, but that's not saying it's going to be easy.
So just as by way of conclusion today, I just want to ask you a couple of things again, future focused, I suppose. What do you hope that people will see by big organisations like Bellway becoming more conscious about being sustainable?
So I think one of the big things that we need to do is we have to make the future home standard and the transition to air source heat pumps a success. Because if you read some parts of the media, every day there's a negative story about air source heat pumps. So we need to make sure that the transition is smooth for us, and actually our customers have a really good experience when they're buying a home with an air source heat pump, because unfortunately, actually there's probably a lot of pressure to roll back from that. And unfortunately, if we can't make air source heat pumps work in new build homes, then it's going to be a real challenge to get people persuaded to swap out their gas boilers for a heat pump in their homes. So for me, the number one thing that we need to do is get air source heat pumps right.
And are there any tips that you could give to our listeners on how to be more sustainable in their everyday lives?
Well, one thing that I try to do is get public transport as much as I possibly can, because that reduces emissions, but it also reduces space on the road. So I got the metro into work this morning and it was absolutely rammed. But if every one of those people was in a car on their own on the road, then you can't imagine how much gridlock there would be. So actually, I think public transport is a big thing. Another thing is that next year, what's coming down the line is the segregation of food waste. So what I want to see everyone doing is cleaning out your lunch, cleaning out your yogurt pot into a food waste container, washing out that container and then putting it into the recycling. So public transport and recycling, I think they're two things that people can quite easily do in their day-to-day lives.
Brilliant. And then last question from me really, which is sort of linked to hints and tips. What would you like to see people set as an intention to, I suppose, help move Bellway forward in the sustainability space?
So I think for me, biodiversity is a big area that we really need to focus on. So we have a target now for hedgehog highways, swift bricks, bat boxes, etc., to be installed in every home. And what we need to do is really focus on making sure that that is actually delivered on our projects across the country. So those nature interventions is something that we really need to focus on and get right.
And how can staff at large support that? What can they do to be involved and help push that agenda forward?
I think for me, it's just being aware of it. So understanding that this needs to happen, and then when you're out on site, actually question. So is that hedgehog highway fitted? Is this site meant to have a bat box or a swift brick? I think awareness is the starting point, and then having a conversation, and the rest should flow from there, really.
Simon, thank you so much for today. That wraps up our session on Bricking It with Bellway. Big thank you for coming along and sharing more about sustainability and your career journey on this episode. If you've been tuning in and you're thinking about a career with Bellway, then please head to our show notes for all the information on current roles at Bellway and how to apply. We'd love to have you on the team.